Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing Severance Season 2, Episode 5. And this season is progressing quite nicely and I honestly hope they can stick the landing. The episode begins with this mysterious man we were informed about a few episodes ago who brings shipments down to the exports hall. This man, whose face we don't see, comes to collect these tools. These tools look like something you would use in a surgery. And I do remember Petey mentioning that there are people who never clock out, people like Miss Casey. Before reuniting with the Innies, we follow up with Mark. And maybe I'm being paranoid, but I feel like Mark's sister was being a little bit too nosy for my liking. She's literally the only friend that he has. Like, I've never really seen him hang out with anyone, or anytime he tries to make friends or lovers, it never really lasts for very long. At one point during their conversation, she asks if he's kind of figured out another way to send messages to his innie, as if she already knew what he was up to. And I get why he didn't want to tell her, but it still felt a bit off. In the last episode, we saw that Mark's innie was starting to feel the effects of reintegration. Mark is trying to sort out his life. Helena is meeting with members of Lumen to discuss the aftermath of that retreat. And Helena is so traumatized. She refers to the Innies as monsters. And mind you, this is the second time an Innie has tried to kill her. I feel like she hasn't learned anything. In the meeting, they mentioned how Helena's tempers have been rebalanced. And they offered something called an obligement session, which honestly sounded like a break room. Helena's presence on the severed floor almost destroyed their project. Now, I don't like Milchick, but I was a bit annoyed that he was being blamed for a lot of this. Helena insisted that she be on the severed floor and not her innie, and she's not really someone you can say no to. I thought the fact that her father refused to meet her also suggests that he definitely blames her for all of this. When Helly's innie finally goes back on the severed floor, she's absolutely terrified because her last memory is of almost being killed. She's greeted by Miss Wong, who is sitting in front of this propaganda painting that depicts the Innies as these revolutionaries. Immediately, all the Innies storm to Mr. Milchick's office. They want answers, and Mr. Milchick's response was desperate to say the least. Compared Helena to a king doing valuable research on her subjects, as if her presence there was supposed to somehow make their lives easier, like she was doing this from the goodness of her heart. He tells the team that Irving has gone on an elongated cruise voyage and he won't be coming back. In reality, Irving is doing just fine. However, his outie is definitely paranoid, and we find out this episode that he was reunited with Bert. Now, from what little we see of Irving's outie this episode, he knows a lot about the company. The only glimpse that we get of this is this conversation he's having with someone over a payphone, mentioning how Lumen knows what the Innies are up to. It seems like Irving definitely worked for Lumen in some capacity as an unsevered person before deciding to become severed. This is the second time Irving has been fired, and he is definitely worried. He starts taking down all the paintings off his wall, and I think he's definitely on high alert. What I thought was really strange is that Mr. Milchick told Bert that the reason he was being fired is due to an erotic entanglement. And it's this detail that alerted Bert that it was Irving's innie that was banging on his door. And so Mr. Milchick definitely did not have to tell Bert that he was having an affair on the severed floor, but maybe he was hoping that they would meet up. Now, while Irving's outie is trying to figure out what's going on, all the Innies are feeling incredibly bad for the way they treated him. Dylan in particular is very angry. He purposely distanced himself from Irving because he was enjoying these family visits with his outie's wife. And you can tell Mark is starting to clock that there's something going on between Dylan and Mr. Milchick when Mr. Milchick mentions revoking privileges, because Mark S. was like, what privileges do we have? The big reveal in the last episode definitely destroyed Mark's innie. As team leader, he feels as if he let Irving down. And I think he also feels bad because he was so concerned with his outie's world and not really concerned with his own. I thought Mark's attitude towards Helly was a bit petty and cold. In order to distract himself, he throws himself into his work, which for the time being is the best case scenario for Lumen. And he feels totally played. He told Helena everything. And so it feels like all the progress that he had made was for nothing. None of it meant anything. Granted, it's not Helly's fault that her outie hijacked her body, but I do understand Mark's frustration. He really tried to find out what happened to his outie's wife, and now it just feels like that's never going to happen. In an attempt to get back in their good graces, Mr. Milchick agrees to have a funeral. This is the first time we get any insight into Miss Wong and Mr. Milchick's relationship. Miss Wong's presence there is very strange. It almost feels like she's there to monitor him, to watch him. She tells Mr. Milchick that she doesn't believe the innies should be allowed to have a funeral because it makes them feel like people. And the weird thing is, the innies are not AI. These are people. Though they might not know a lot about the outside world, they definitely are able to think and feel for themselves. And Mr. Milchick's tone with her was a bit rude, and we find out later why that is, because she's been snitching on him and just ratting him out every chance she gets. At the funeral, Mark S. is totally disconnected, and Dylan is the only one that I think is truly grieving him, or at least allowing himself to feel something. Annoyed, Dylan tells Helly that Miss Casey is his Audi's wife. Helly's reaction and her walk and her whole vibe, I mean, you could tell that it was her innie. And now that we're seeing Helly's innie again, it really does feel like they are two different people. And in the last episode, Mark and Helly slept together, and I do think a part of this big project that Lumen has going on is to bring Mark and Helly together. And it's hard to tell right now, but I do feel like Helena caught feelings, because when Mark S. clocks out of Lumen, we get a brief shot of Helena watching him leave. Now, I'm not sure if she's in love with him or if she's worried about the consequences of her actions. Now, one point that's been made clear throughout the season is that Mark needs Helly to finish this project, and maybe for the time being he's working, but Mark just feels like a ticking time bomb, and Lumen basically had no choice but to bring Helly's innie back in hopes of stabilizing the situation. During the funeral, Dylan finds a message from Irving. Before dying, Irving tells Dylan to hang in there, and so Dylan is staring at this poster, and he's immediately reminded of his friend's last moments. And so on a whim, he starts poking around, and he finds not only Irving's drawings, but a note at the back, likely detailing what he found out about the exports hall. And even though Lumen knows that the innies are starting to investigate and they're really starting to uncover a lot, they're too deep into this project that they really have no choice but to take the risk. In some ways, Mr. Milchick's kindness reforms, it did help for the time being. It created a sense of community. However, in an instant, it almost just came undone. I thought one of the highlights this episode was Mr. Milchick's performance review. Prior to the review, he asks Natalie how she felt about receiving those offensive paintings. If you remember, to celebrate his promotion, he was gifted these really insane paintings meant to help him feel more connected to Kier and the company. And the whole thing was a really sad attempt to make Lumen look more equal and more progressive than it really is. Throughout this performance review, it really felt like they were threatening Mr. Milchick, basically telling him, listen, if Mark S. doesn't finish this project, we are throwing you under the bus. I thought the criticisms against him were very true to life. Mr. Milchick has done everything to assimilate to this cult, but it's just not enough. The comments about his vocabulary and his speech were incredibly condescending and offensive, especially considering the guy reviewing him was doing the same thing. And Mr. Milchick, I feel like, is going through an awakening. He has had to endure a lot of microaggressions, and I think Natalie feels the same way. Like, we get little shots of her watching Mr. Milchick, and you can tell she's rooting for him. Like, she looked like she wanted to get up and just scream, like, hey, back off him. But it just seems like he's slowly starting to come undone. The effects of Lumen are starting to wear off, and I'm not really sure how much more Mr. Milchick can take. I also think seeing the way Miss Cobell was treated really did shake him. She literally uncovered this whole thing. And despite her sacrifice, she was thrown out as if she was nothing. And so he's reevaluating his place in this raggedy company. After the meeting, he goes over his performance review, and you can tell he's really upset. And I do think some part of him feels very guilty about what happened to Irving. I think some part of him does blame Helena because she insisted on being there as herself. Following this review, he immediately confronts Mark S., who looks like he's ready to fight, like he's over it. Mark basically, in so many words, calls him out on his BS and lets him know that he will never ever take his word for anything ever again. Mr. Milchick, being the genius that he is, pivots and calls Mark out for sleeping with Helly's Audi. And this was a bombshell moment because it was like, how did you know this took place? Like, how much surveillance? Did you have cameras in this tent? Like, and the way Mr. Milchick told him, He's like, listen, I saw everything. I seriously doubt Helena would approve of this level of surveillance, which is why I think part of this Cold Harbor project is to bring them together. And maybe a part of Mr. Milchick's prerogative was making sure that happens. And speaking of surveillance, I never mentioned it, but I think Natalie's visits to Rickon's house is also really unsettling. Rickon has become very committed to Lumen, and I think the power and the money is starting to get to his head. It's also concerning because Lumen knows that Mark's sister is investigating what happened to his wife, so they want to keep tabs on her. I still don't know what exactly happened to Mark's wife, like how they were able to switch the bodies, because according to Mark, he saw the body. The body was cremated. Like, as far as he's concerned, there's just no way for his wife not to be dead. But this doctor that he's been working with is telling him otherwise. The episode ends with Mark finally getting exactly what he wants, seeing his wife again. He starts to hear his wife's voice, and he starts to see himself in this dark hallway. First time he hears and sees his wife again, it's during a wellness session. So you can tell that a lot of his innie's memories are starting to infiltrate his own. I think one of the most shocking parts of this twist is how Mark's innie and Miss Casey, like, they don't recognize each other at all in season 1. Like, there was nothing in their interactions to suggest that they knew each other whatsoever. And so if she is dead, it would be interesting to find out how they're keeping her alive. And I'm also low-key thinking Miss Wong is not alive. Like, I don't think she's a real person. I think whatever they did to Miss Casey, they did to this kid as well, but there's still a lot to unpack. Again, I hope they're able to stick the landing, because if not, this could end up being one of the best shows ever or one of the worst. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.